So, when are you finally going to finish your degree, Julia? My father's question sliced through the ambient conversation at our family dinner table, silencing everyone. David was already running his own firm by your age. 29 years of being measured against my brother crashed down on me at once as I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, suddenly aware of 12 pairs of eyes trained on me. My mother, my brother David, his perfect wife, their two perfect children, my aunts, uncles, and cousins, all waiting for my response, for my usual apologetic smile and self-deprecating joke. That's how it had always been. David, the golden child, 3 years my senior who could do no wrong. And me, the perpetual disappointment, the family punchline. Tonight, it was my father's birthday, and we were celebrating at my parents' bungalow in Greenfield, Massachusetts, a house I'd grown up in but never felt at home in. "I'm actually doing quite well at the gallery, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We just secured an exhibition with—" "A gallery assistant isn't a real career, Julia," my mother chimed in, serving more mashed potatoes to David's plate without him asking. "We just worry about your future. You're not getting any younger." My brother David cleared his throat, ready to change the subject and save me from further embarrassment like he always did. The benevolent heir apparent, extending charity to his struggling sister. But something inside me snapped. I placed my napkin beside my plate and stood up slowly. "You know what? You're right. I'm not getting any younger, and neither are either of you." My voice sounded strange in my ears, calm and clear. "Which makes it even more tragic that after 29 years, you still can't see me." The room went still. My father's face hardened into the expression I'd seen 1,000 times, disappointment mixed with irritation. My mother looked scandalized, her eyes darting to the other guests. "Julia, this isn't the time," she warned. "It's your father's birthday." "It's never the time, Mom. That's the point." I glanced at the family photos lining the dining room wall. David's graduation. David's wedding. David's children. A single photo of me from high school, tucked in the corner like an afterthought. Do you know what it's like to grow up feeling like you're always just taking up space in someone else's story? To have your achievements dismissed and your struggles magnified? I looked directly at my father. To be told in 100 small ways every day that you will never be good enough. My Aunt Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat. My young niece watched with wide eyes. David stared down at his plate. "I was 5 when I won my first art competition. You didn't come because David had a soccer game. I was 12 when I had my first panic attack because I got a B+ and knew you'd be disappointed. I was 16 when I stopped telling you about my life because I realized you weren't really listening anyway." "That's not fair," my father said, his voice rising. "We've given you everything." "Everything except what I actually needed," I interrupted, "which was for you to be proud of me, just once, for who I am, not for who you wanted me to be." My mother stood now too, her face flushed. "How dare you make such accusations in front of everyone? After all we've done for you." I laughed, a sound without humor. "See, that's the thing. You've never actually seen me as a person separate from you, just an extension of yourselves, a reflection of your parenting, a project that failed." David finally broke his silence. "Jules, come on. They love you. You know they do." I looked at my brother, the golden child, the perfect son, and saw something I'd never noticed before. Guilt. He knew. He'd always known. "I know they love me, David, but they've never respected me. There's a difference." My mother was crying now, my father stone-faced. The rest of the family sat frozen, witnesses to the collapse of our carefully constructed facade. I reached for my purse hanging on the back of my chair. "I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to keep showing up just to be reminded of all the ways I don't measure up." "Julia, stop being so dramatic," my father said, but there was a new note in his voice. Uncertainty. "I'm not being dramatic. I'm finally being honest." I walked to the door, then turned back to face my family. "And for the record, I'm the associate curator now. I got promoted 3 months ago. Not that anyone bothered to ask." I walked out the front door into the cool September evening, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I got into my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that had been the subject of many concerned comments from my parents. "Shouldn't you get something safer, dear?" And just sat there, waiting for the shaking in my hands to subside. I had done it. After 29 years of swallowing hurt, of shrinking myself to fit their expectations, of accepting the scraps of attention that fell from David's table, I had finally spoken up. And now what? My phone buzzed with a text. David, you okay? Want me to come out? I didn't respond. Instead, I started the car and drove away from my childhood home, heading back to my apartment in Northampton. The 40-minute drive gave me time to think, to breathe, to process the magnitude of what had just happened. By the time I unlocked my door, I was exhausted, but strangely calm. My apartment was small, but entirely mine. Art covered the walls, some purchased from local artists, some my own work that I'd never had the courage to show my family. Plants thrived on every available surface. Books were stacked beside my reading chair. It wasn't impressive by my family standards, but it was mine, and for the first time, that felt like enough. I kicked off my shoes, poured myself a glass of wine, and curled up on my couch. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since I left. Texts from David, my mother, even my Aunt Margaret. I turned it off and set it aside. Whatever fallout was coming, it could wait until morning. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in years. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through my curtains and a strange sense of lightness. For a moment, I lay still, trying to identify the unfamiliar feeling. Then it hit me, relief. I'd finally said what I needed to say, consequences be damned. I made coffee and checked my phone. 23 texts, 7 missed calls, and 3 voicemails. I scrolled through the texts first. David, Jules, call me. They're upset, but they'll get over it. Mom's crying. Dad's pretending he's fine, but he's not. Please just let me know you're home safe. I don't understand why you would humiliate us like that in front of everyone. We've always wanted what's best for you. Call me when you're ready to apologize. Dad, your behavior was unacceptable. Proud of you, honey. Been a long time coming. That last one surprised me. I'd always thought of Aunt Margaret as my father's loyal sister, someone who shared his traditional values and expectations. Maybe there were more allies in my family than I realized. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I got dressed and headed to work. The Northampton Gallery of Contemporary Art wasn't large, but it had a solid reputation in Western Massachusetts. I'd started as a part-time assistant while still in art school, worked my way up to full-time, then assistant curator, and now associate curator. My current project was an exhibition of emerging women artists from rural New England, something I'd pitched and championed. "Morning, Julia," called Marcos, our security guard. "How was the big family dinner?" I hesitated. "Eventful," I finally said, and he raised an eyebrow but didn't press. The gallery was quiet on Monday mornings, giving me time to catch up on emails and planning. I was reviewing submissions for our spring exhibition when my phone rang. David. I almost declined the call, but something made me answer. "Hey," I said. "Jesus, Jules, finally." He sounded tired. "Are you okay?" "I'm at work, David." "Right, sorry." He paused. "Look, about last night." I meant what I said. "I know you did, and you weren't wrong." I nearly dropped my phone. In 29 years, I couldn't remember David ever saying those words to me. "Mom and Dad are pretty shaken up," he continued. "Dad's acting like it didn't affect him, but I caught him staring at your high school art portfolio this morning, the one he keeps in his office." I didn't know he'd kept any of my work. "And Mom? Well, she's Mom, alternating between being hurt and being angry, but she's thinking about what you said, I can tell." "I'm not going to apologize, David. I'm not asking you to. Actually, I think I might owe you an apology." I sat back in my chair, stunned. "What?" "I knew what was happening, Jules. I saw how they treated you differently. I benefited from it, and I never said anything." The admission hit me hard, a validation of something I'd felt my whole life but had begun to doubt. Maybe I was just oversensitive. Maybe I was imagining the difference in how they treated us. But no, David saw it too. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked, my voice small. He sighed. "Because it was easier not to. Because I liked being the favorite. Because I was a kid, and then a teenager, and then a self-absorbed college student. By the time I was mature enough to really see it, the pattern was so established that I didn't know how to break it." He paused. "That's not an excuse, just the truth." We were both quiet for a moment. "They want to see you," he finally said. "To talk." "I don't think I'm ready for that." "That's fair. Just, Don't cut them off completely. They're not perfect, but they do love you. Loving someone and respecting them are different things, David. I know, and for what it's worth, I respect you. A lot, especially after last night. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the wall of my office where I'd hung a small watercolor I'd painted in college. A self-portrait, not of my face, but of my shadow, stretched long across a sun-drenched field. My professor had called it poignant and revealing. My parents had called it interesting in the tone that meant they didn't get it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work. The exhibition was coming together beautifully, and I threw myself into it, grateful for the distraction. I exchanged occasional texts with David, but maintained my distance from my parents. My mother continued to send messages that alternated between guilt-tripping and angry. My father remained mostly silent, texting only once to ask if I was still having a tantrum. Then, 3 weeks after the dinner, my father showed up at the gallery. I was in the main exhibition space, directing the hanging of a large mixed media piece, when Marcos appeared at my side. "Julia, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's your father." My stomach dropped. "Thanks, Marcos. I'll be right there." He was standing in the lobby, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the contemporary sculptures and installation pieces. He wore what I thought of as his business casual outfit, pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, as if he was coming to inspect my workplace. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "This is a surprise. Hello, Julia." He glanced around. "Can we talk somewhere private?" I led him to my office, acutely aware of the curious glances from my colleagues. My father had never visited the gallery before, despite numerous invitations to openings and events over the years. Once the door closed behind us, he stood awkwardly in the center of the room, taking in the space, my degrees on the wall, the stacks of exhibition catalogs, the art books and portfolios. "So this is where you work," he said. "For the past 7 years, yes." He nodded, still looking around rather than at me. "It's nice, professional." I waited, not offering him a seat or making it easier for him. Finally, he turned to face me. "Your mother wanted me to come, to talk to you." Of course, he hadn't come on his own initiative. About? About what you said at dinner." He shifted uncomfortably. "She thinks we need to clear the air." "And what do you think, Dad?" He frowned. "I think you were disrespectful and made a scene at my birthday dinner." "Is that all you got from what I said? That I was disrespectful?" "You embarrassed us in front of the whole family." I shook my head, disappointment washing over me. "This was a waste of time. I have work to do." "Wait." He held up a hand. That's not all I wanted to say." I crossed my arms and waited. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at me, his expression softer than I'd seen it in years. "Your Aunt Margaret gave me hell after you left. Said she'd been watching us mistreat you for years and was glad you finally stood up for yourself." That surprised me again. Quiet, proper Aunt Margaret. And then David, well, he had some things to say too. My father ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was stressed. He made me look at some things I didn't want to see. Such as? Such as the fact that we've never given you the same benefit of the doubt that we gave him, the same support. It wasn't exactly an admission of favoritism, but it was closer than I'd ever expected to get. Why is that, Dad? Why was David always the golden child, and I was always the disappointment? He flinched at my words. "We never thought of you as a disappointment, Julia. You never said it out loud, but you showed it in every other way possible." My father was quiet for a long moment, looking around my office again, his eyes landing on the small watercolor on my wall. "You painted that," he said, not a question. "In college, it's a self-portrait." He studied it, his brow furrowed. "A shadow." "Yes." Something flickered across his face, recognition maybe, or regret. He turned back to me. "I don't know why it was easier with David," he said finally. "Maybe because he was like me, practical, straightforward. I understood him. You were always different, creative, sensitive, more like your mother's side of the family." "That's not an excuse for making me feel like I wasn't enough." "No," he agreed quietly, "it's not." He hesitated, then said, "Your mother wants you to come to dinner. Just the 4 of us. To talk. I don't know if I'm ready for that." He nodded. "I understand, but think about it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. And she wanted me to give you this. I took it cautiously, not unfolding it. I should go, he said. You're busy. But Julia, I am proud of you. This, he gestured around my office, what you've built here. It's impressive. I just didn't know how to say it before. After he left, I sat down at my desk and unfolded the paper. It was a photo I'd never seen before. Me at about 8 years old, sitting at our dining room table, intensely focused on a drawing. My father was sitting beside me, watching not the drawing but my face, with an expression of unmistakable pride. On the back, my mother had written, "We didn't always get it right, but we always loved you. Can we try again?" I stared at the photo for a long time, memories surfacing. Small moments of connection with my parents that had been overshadowed by the constant comparison to David. My father teaching me to ride a bike. My mother framing my first charcoal drawing. The way they'd helped me move into my apartment, my father meticulously hanging each picture exactly where I wanted it. It wasn't enough to erase years of feeling second best, but it was something, a starting point. That weekend, I drove back to Greenfield, not to my parents' house, but to Aunt Margaret's cozy cottage on the edge of town. She welcomed me with a tight hug and a pot of tea. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, leading me to her sunroom. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," I said, settling into a wicker chair. "Better than I expected, actually." "Good." She poured the tea. "You know, I've wanted to say something to your parents for years about how they treated you, but it wasn't my place. It had to come from you." "Why did they do it, Aunt Margaret? Was I really that different from what they wanted?" She considered this, stirring honey into her tea. "Your parents? They're products of their generation. Richard, your father, grew up with very traditional expectations. Boys were supposed to be practical, follow in their father's footsteps. Girls were supposed to be, well, decorative, essentially. When David came along, he fit right into your father's idea of a son. And then you came along, bright, creative, sensitive, and they just didn't know what to do with you." "That doesn't make it okay." "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But understanding might help you decide what comes next." I sipped my tea, thinking. Dad came to the gallery. He gave me a photo from Mom. "I know. Helen called me right after. She was hoping you'd agree to dinner." "I'm thinking about it." Aunt Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm on your side. But for what it's worth, I think they're really trying to understand. Your little speech at dinner shook them up good. Made them look at themselves in a way they never had to before." I stayed with Aunt Margaret that night, talking late into the evening. The next morning, I called my mother and agreed to dinner the following weekend. Not at their house, but at a neutral restaurant in Amherst. The week passed quickly, the exhibition opening keeping me busy and distracted. Before I knew it, Saturday evening had arrived, and I was parking outside the small Italian restaurant where we'd agreed to meet. They were already there, sitting at a table near the back. My mother spotted me first, her face lighting up with a nervous smile. My father stood as I approached. David pulled out a chair for me. "Hi," I said, settling in. "You look well," my mother said. "I like your hair." I'd recently cut my long brown hair into a short bob, something she would have criticized before. "Thanks," I said, then fell silent, not sure what came next. The waiter brought menus and took our drink orders. An awkward silence fell over the table. Finally, David spoke. "So, Jules, how's the exhibition going? The one with the women artists?" "It opened on Thursday," I said. "We had over 200 people at the reception. The Gazette is running a feature on it next week." "That's wonderful," my mother said. "Isn't that wonderful, Richard?" My father nodded. "Very impressive." Another silence fell. "Julia," my mother finally said, her voice strained. "About what happened at the dinner?" "Helen," my father interrupted them. "We agreed to let Julia lead this conversation." I looked at him in surprise. That was new. "It's okay," I said. "We need to talk about it." My mother twisted her napkin in her hands. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, your father and I, about what you said, about how we made you feel." Her eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know, Mom." "But intentions don't matter as much as impact," she continued, surprising me again. "At least that's what the book says." "The book?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a paperback titled, "When Good Parents Make Bad Mistakes: Healing Family Relationships." Your Aunt Margaret recommended it, she explained. I've been reading it every night. Your father, too. I glanced at my father, who looked uncomfortable but nodded. We didn't see what we were doing, he said gruffly. We thought we were being supportive in our own way. But we weren't seeing you for who you are. We were seeing you for who we thought you should be. Which was never good enough, I said quietly. No, he agreed, meeting my eyes. But that was our failure, not yours. The waiter returned with our drinks and took our food orders. When he left, my mother reached across the table and laid her hand on mine. We'd like to come to your exhibition, she said. If that's all right with you. You want to see my work? Of course we do, she said. We should have been to all of them. I looked at my father, who nodded. I'd like to see what you've built, he said. We ate dinner, the conversation stilted at times, but gradually easing into something resembling normal. They asked questions about my work, real questions, not the dismissive queries of before. David talked about his kids, but for once, my parents didn't use them as a measuring stick against my childless state. At the end of the meal, as we stood outside the restaurant preparing to part ways, my father cleared his throat. Julia, I want you to know something. I am proud of you. I always have been. I just didn't know how to show it, because what you do is so different from anything I understand. He hesitated, then added, but I'd like to try to understand it better. My mother hugged me tightly. We love you, sweetheart, so much. Please don't shut us out. I won't, I promised. But things have to be different now. They will be, she said. We're trying. As I drove home that night, I felt a curious mix of emotions. Cautious hope, lingering hurt, a new sense of strength. Standing up to my parents hadn't fixed everything. 29 years of feeling second best couldn't be erased by one dinner. But it was a beginning. The following Thursday, my parents and David came to the gallery. I gave them a tour of the exhibition, explaining each artist's work and vision. My father asked questions, genuine questions about techniques and themes. My mother marveled at the diversity of styles. David hung back, watching with a small smile as our parents engaged with my world for perhaps the first time. When we reached the small watercolor in my office, my shadow self-portrait, my father stood looking at it for a long time. I understand it now, he said quietly. You felt like a shadow in our family, never fully seen. Yes, I said simply. He turned to me, his eyes wet. I'm so sorry, Julia. In that moment, something shifted between us. Not healing exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that was all I'd ever wanted from him. 2 months later, I had dinner at my parents' house again. This time when I walked in, I noticed something different. Among the photos on the wall, David's graduation, David's wedding, David's children, there were new additions. A professional photo of me at the gallery opening, a newspaper clipping about the exhibition, a framed invitation to my upcoming curator talk. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old patterns emerged, a thoughtless comparison, a dismissive comment quickly retracted. But there was effort and awareness, and most importantly, respect. As for me, I was changing too. Speaking up at that dinner had unlocked something in me, a confidence that spilled into other areas of my life. I applied for a grant I'd been too intimidated to pursue before. I started dating again after a 2-year hiatus. I began working on my own art in the evenings, something I'd abandoned years ago. And when my father called one afternoon to tell me, with unmistakable pride in his voice, that he'd bragged about my daughter, the curator, to his golf buddies, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd never been second best after all, just unseen. And now, finally, I was coming into focus.